Well, ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. We're here again in X-Plane 10 with the IXEG 737-300, and we're heading down the Adriatic towards Dubrovnik in Croatia. A little bit of a wet and windy day today. Dubrovnik's quite an interesting airport to operate into. There's an ILS approach onto runway 12. If you want to land on runway 30, there is a VOR arrival, but most traffic from the north and the west would circle to land on runway 30. Very similar to what we did in Pisa. The only difference is it's got prescribed tracks for the circling rather than using the timings like we did with Pisa. We'll have a look at that as we get a little bit closer. What's important at the moment is we'll take a radar vector of about 060 degrees. Descend to altitude of 4,000 feet. I'll do that with VS. Speed's already back at 210 knots. The aircraft's configured as you may expect by now. Everything is as before. We've got the lights on, pressurization is to standby. Only difference is the engine anti-ice is selected on, so continuous ignition selected. The temperature's plus 5 degrees and there's moisture visible on the windscreen. I'll just make sure that the correct point is at the top of the flight plan. We're on the heading anyway. And if you remember back to Pisa, going down the ILS, we couldn't use the approach mode. We had to use the forelock and vertical speed. Well, it's exactly the same situation today. What I want to do is make sure we get to this 12 dBk point, 4,000 feet with the gear down, flaps 15. And the speed back to 150. Reason being there'll be a substantial tailwind on the ILS, so we want to keep the ground speed back so we don't need too much of a rate of descent. The prescribed tracks I told you about, I've drawn those on the fixed pages. We'll talk them through when we get there. The radio configuration, I've got the ILS 110.1 on here, Dubrovnik 115.4, and Cavtat 397 and Gruda 414. So we're using all four of the radio aids today. On the RMI, we're looking at the ADFs there. So the single needle would be Cavtat, the double needle would be Gruda. The DME still comes from Dubrovnik, and the ILS, it doesn't have DME, which is why we're using the Dubrovnik. There's no point in rushing into these things, so I'll select flaps 1 and speed 190. Doing about 900 feet a minute, so the aircraft should be able to slow down. And at this point we'd normally be cleared for the ILS approach. So alarm forelock. There we go, looking a little bit better out the window just now. Now we could do this as a continuous descent arrival, but because of some of the changes I've got to make on the altitude window, I'll have a little fly level segment. It just makes it easier because there's only just me operating the aircraft today. What I will do is come right another 10 degrees just to refine the intercept. So when we look at 190, flaps 1, just verify we've got continuous ignition selected. We had it on anyway because of the anti-ice, so that's fine. And I'll come back to 180 and flaps 5. Got about 5 tons of fuel on the aircraft, that's fine. All the bugs are set up correctly, and I'll do a flap 40 arrival rather than flap 30 today. So I've got the VAP plus the wind correction on here, plus 15, 170, that lets us clean up to flap 1, and 190, that's when we clean up to flap 0 on the missed approach. There we go, it's picked up the localizer, and we've got Alt Acquire as well. What I'm waiting is for it to say is Alt Hold. Once it says Alt Hold, I can adjust the altitude and it won't move. So there we go, Alt Hold, and I'll set the circling of 2,200. There we go. I'll also set the break-off track for the circling. It's 158 with a little bit of wind, so I'll try 161 just now. You can see the first radial ring coming down. The first radius, that's around Cavtat. I'll chat about that when we get there. What's important is we go down on the slope. So there's glide slope coming down. I'll take flaps 15, gear down, and speed 150. Arm the speed brake. Hello. And with that, I'll select vertical speeds and go down at appropriate rate. Ground speed's 180, so I'm looking for 900 to 1000. Let's start off with 900 because the ground speed will wash off in a second. There's the bay at Dubrovnik. The airfield's up here on a plateau, and the old city round about this area here. The old city's where they filmed Game of Thrones King's Landing series, just out of interest. So following the glide slope down, that's with the vertical speed. Just check 170, yeah, so 900 should work. And speed's back at 150. Everything's looking good. So we can see Cavtat on here. That's the first NDB we're interested in. I'm going to follow a course of 158 outbound from Cavtat. Out to about almost 4 miles outbound. So that's the 4-mile ring and the radio coming out. Again, we're going to use it with heading. But it gives us good situational awareness using the fixed page like this. Very similar to what you saw on the Gatwick arrival, we're just marking off some points. Just a case of monitoring the aircraft on the way down and flying it with a vertical speed. Quite common to get a marker beacon when you don't have an ILS DME. Marker beacons are very rare these days, but when you don't have an ILS DME, it's quite common to see them. There you go, it's gone into alt acquire. So once it comes to alt hold, what I'll do is I'll set the missed approach altitude. If I was to change it just now, I'd get a VS mode, which I don't really want. So alt hold, and then I can set that back to 4000. The old city's around about here. So when we track outbound, prescribed track, it's the 158 radial, so I'm looking for the tail of the single needle to be about 158, although the nav display gives us a good indication as well. So what I'm looking to do is click heading select. I'll do that just now, and I'm looking for my white track line here to come around and either parallel or overlay this green line here. I'm going to fly out to this first intersection here. That's the 4-mile point. If we're a little bit on the wide side, it doesn't really matter. What's important is I get to this point here, which is the end of the downwind leg. See the arrival onto the ILS runway 12. It's still quite challenging. There's a lot of terrain here, and if you imagine the wind coming down the airfield this way, spilling over these hills, you'll get quite a bit of turbulence in this area here. I don't want to go outside 4.8 miles. You see the terrain out here? I want to stay within 4.8 miles to stay safe of that terrain. There's a little col in the hill there that I'm going to aim for. Over the coast I'll be around 1900 feet or so, and trying to stay above 1000 radio all the way around. You can see how having the speed back and the aircraft configured, it really makes life a little bit easier now. So turning onto the downwind heading, again I'm trying to put my white track line onto this cross between this radial and this radius here. maybe just a touch outside. Come a couple of degrees to the right. Again, it's a visual procedure. I'm just using this to kind of get back to the more or less the correct position in space. Okay, so a little bit non-standard now because, as I said, it's single pilot makes things a little bit more difficult. Tracking downwind, I'll turn the flight directors off. I'll leave the autopilot in for a second. I'll also take the auto thrust out. I'll use the speed button here, and then it drops back to the arm mode. That means that I've still got low speed protection available. I'll also click it into control wheel steering just for a second, and then I'll spin the heading round for the missed approach track off runway 30. It's about 295. There we go. So there's the kind of area we're aiming for in the hills here. Let the autopilot out, and I'll start the turn. Bring the thrust back a little bit. I select flaps 25 just now. Flaps 30. Don't need to keep coming down. So over the coast, just around 1900 or so, maybe a touch on the high side. Looking for the runway, you can see how the picture's really quite difficult there with the terrain and the runway being sloping and also rising terrain towards it. 1700 feet as we cross the ridge there, just about to 1100 baro, flaps 40, and I'll start the turning. Yes, it's really quite difficult in the sim. If you can move your head around, it's a lot easier. There we go, got the pappies, so I've got 2 reds and 2 whites, that's fine. Ground speed is 117 knots, I'm looking for about 600 or 700 feet per minute. Just needs a little bit more thrust with flaps 40. So 1000, I've got the gear down, speed brakes armed, everything's looking good, vertical profile looks good. Just indicating a touch high there, I'll correct that briefly. Again, in the simulator, you really have to fly the picture to the runway. The pappies are very, the sharp changeover between red and white makes it quite difficult to fly the pappies. And at this point, you'll be getting all sorts of turbulence coming off those hills as well, and the airport's on a little bit of a plateau. You can see the valley off to the right there.
200. 100. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Okay, reverse. Back to idle. The auto brake's still working, so push that out and then go for manual brakes, looking for this first exit onto the apron here. Runway's quite wet, so I'll take it nice and slow. There's no 3D scenery at Dubrovnik just yet, but I think the terrain environment and the challenge of flying the approach are good enough reason to come to Dubrovnik in X-Plane 10. So I'll bring the aircraft to a halt, set the parking brake, so the speed brakes, take a look outside, and we'll have a chat about what we did. So just like the Pisa video, we flew down the ILS using vertical speed and forelock. That allowed us to keep the autopilot in, and we broke off onto heading mode to fly the circling prescribed tracks. We drew some fixies on the screen from CavTat and DBK. The reason we did the fixies is it's a prescribed track circling approach. Fixies just in the same manner as we used at Gatwick when we were self-positioning for the ILS. We configured the aircraft to gear down, flaps 15, speed 150 to go down the ILS, a little bit slower than normal. The reason being the ground speed with that tailwind pushing us along is still about the same as you'd have at 180 knots. It would be quite difficult to slow the aircraft down if we're doing a ground speed of about 210 down the ILS. We'd need to use the gear early anyway, and a lot of speed brakes. So it's a lot easier just to intercept in a higher drag configuration, go down the ILS. We set the circling minima on the altitude target, broke off onto the heading, flew the prescribed tracks by pointing the white track line at the green fixies that we had on the map. In a little bit of sim reality, I turned the flight directors off and used control wheel steering just to hold the aircraft pitch and attitude while I messed around with the FCU or the MCP panel. We made sure that we had the missed approach altitude set and a track that took us out on the runway 30 extended centerline just for a missed approach. In real life, you'd brief the missed approach on a circling in a lot of detail because it's quite challenging on how you perform that. But straight ahead for runway 30 would keep us safe in the sim. We turned in, we watched the rate of descent, had the aircraft on a reasonably good vertical profile for the 1,000 feet point, and I used flap 40 for the landing, just to give us a little bit more control, a little bit more thrust on the final approach. As a result, I kept the power on for just a little bit longer on the flare than expected. And finally, with a little bit of crosswind in the flare, just a touch of rudder to align the aircraft with the centerline just before we touch down. I hope you enjoyed watching the video. It's been quite challenging to make. Certainly using the weather in X-Plane is not as intuitive as perhaps it might be, and I've had some problems with memory issues as well, where the sim was removing the airport just as I was about to fly the circling arrival. That being said, it all seemed to work quite well there, and circling, the nature of it is every time you do it you'll get it slightly differently and something different will happen. It's quite an enjoyable procedure in real life, quite a high workload, but certainly ultimately satisfying when it all comes together. As I said, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you get any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you very much.